I had no idea what was in this book, but a lot of what Attali brings up will actually be totally relevant to what Bitcoin is. And I think countries that align themselves with this, the future of real money, those are going to be the ones that are prosperous and powerful. Now, Attali moves on to say that in the close of the Saddam Hussein situation there in the early 90s there, or he says that the USA is expanding itself into too many foreign interventions and wars. By the way, no, people always ask me this. There's a different Jay Dyer. That is not me that wrote the Bitcoin book. Even though I'm a big supporter of Bitcoin, I don't know who wrote that book. I have no idea. I assume it's a real person. I don't think it was somebody just stealing my name. Anyway, I don't know what you mean. Swan doesn't accept $50 a month purchases. I think they do. I mean, on the app, it's like you can put in any amount a month you want. I think. Let me look and see. So let's see, recurring buy $50 a week. Let's see if you can add a different amount. Edit it. Maybe you have to do it at every. Maybe you have to do it every week and not a month. I don't know. I mean, $50 a month, dude. Come on, you gotta. I would do more than that. That's like $50 a month. Anyway. By the way, so thank you for the support. If you're on X, these links are. I don't have these links on X, so I don't know. You can get these links over on YouTube. Now, let's see, where are we at? Here we go. Back to Attali. Attali says because of all the expansion into foreign interventions, like all previous empires, America will exhaust itself. I think this is a very plausible critique. And here we are, 30-ish years later, and this does seem to be correct. 900 on X, that's awesome. So Attali is correct that in comparing the U.S. to, he says, Spain. This is fascinating. He says, if you look at the history of the Spanish Empire and its fall, he cites a historian named Paul Kennedy, the rise and fall of great powers. He says that once Spain in 1634 decided to get involved in the conflicts of the 30 Years' War, this essentially exhausted them. Spanish monarchy was sagging under massive debts and its inefficient industries. This eventually led to the bankruptcy, the declaration of bankruptcy in the 1640s by the Spanish king, and the full decline of the Spanish Empire. He says that if you compare the U.S. troop movements, this is in the early 90s, by the way. Remember, this is the 90s. Saudi Arabia, Persian Gulf conflict, Iraq, blah, blah, blah. This is key. Now, here's where Attali is really correct. Okay, so note, he's going to get some things very wrong. But this first couple chapters of this book actually surprised me. I mean, he was, particularly the first chapter. This first chapter is like really accurate. And he's accurate from analyzing the problems. He's doing a critique of consumerism. All this stuff's great. Does not mean his answers are great. His answers are terrible. But first chapter is actually really spot on. And basically everything we would say. Now he says, like Spain, the United States is not the first great power to become mired in massive debt. As it retains global responsibilities, America has overextended its debt, and this will become a symptom of fatal imbalance before its eventual demise. The U.S. debt crisis cannot ultimately be solved by kicking the can down the road, etc., and more debt. He says that it is more evident that the central organizing principle of the future, whatever happens to be in the margins, will be economic. This will become apparent as we get closer to the year 2000. The rule of military might be characterized by the Cold War. It's being replaced by the reign of markets. The liberal ideas, the open market, the democracy, the liberal market, etc., have defeated the chief rival of communism. To be sure, however, the conundrum remains. How will we balance this economic growth with social justice? So, in the 90s, 1991, he's already predicting and talking about social justice will be the buzzword of the future. How do we fix the social justice caused by economic disparities? And again, this is like a weird left idea that's totally debunked. I think it should be, even though people still believe this. People think that the reason that there's crime and the reason that people act bad is because of social inequalities. Like as if we had equality, there wouldn't be crime. No, crime happens because humans are fallen and they choose vice. That's why, over virtue. So the left, they typically will, classic progressives, even today, the left, whatever, they mistake the symptoms for the causes. So the reason that we have crime and all this crazy stuff is not inequality. Those are manifestations of fallen human beings choosing evil. But remember, the left can't admit that there's such a thing as evil because that would undo the whole progressivist paradigm. Attali says that the West, America, is particularly transitioning away from an industrial economy to a service economy. That's correct. And in fact, if we recall the analysis of one of the other global elite texts, Alex Abea's RAND Corporation book, Soldiers of Reason, that we did analysis of, Abea actually says that the RAND Corporation was the brains behind that transition. So this was actually a planned thing. It wasn't accidental to transition America into a service economy away from an industrial economy. It was done by design. There's a discussion by him of the dialectical clash of East and West in the Cold War, perhaps leading to a fall of both into a new world order. That didn't end up happening. Instead, we got the victory of Western liberal democratic capitalism, whatever the heck that is. But he says that the real focus of the future won't even be that stuff. It's going to be microchips, biotech, and GMOs. Again, way ahead of his time with that one. He says that we're emerging into a new hyper-industrial order. So he, just like Klaus and Davos' crew, right? Fourth Industrial Revolution. He's talking about the same thing as Klaus there. Inequality will cleave to this new world order, just as the Berlin Wall once divided East and West. He says, though, so in the future, there's still going to be a cleavage of inequality, but it won't be geographical East and West of the Berlin Wall. It'll be super elites with money versus the masses of those that don't have money. How do we determine who will be the super elite with money? It will be whoever has controlling interests in whatever the money of the future is essentially what he says. He doesn't say that in explicit terms because, again, he doesn't know what Bitcoin is. But if you believe in Bitcoin, then that's what he's looking for, right? Like the pagans in Acts 17, groping in the dark. He doesn't know. But he's like, whatever in the future ends up being the solution to money and money power will be that. Now, I have this analogy I came up with that was fitting, I think. And I love that scene in the new Dune, right? Dune 2, where they're trying to figure out how they're going to beat Shaddam the Fourth and the Harkonnens. And Gurney and Paul are like, well, of course, we do have that giant stash of the Atreides family warheads. And the Fremen are all like, the what? The heck is that? Now, in the future, which is already beginning to emerge. If you want your version of the inheritance of the Atreides family money warheads, how many BTC do you have? That's what I'm talking about. Do you see my analogy? That's going to be the thing of the future, right? Do you understand it's difficult already to become a whole coiner? How much more difficult will it be to become a whole coiner when it's $500,000 per Bitcoin? What about when it hits $1 million a Bitcoin? What about when it hits $10 million per Bitcoin 15, 20 years from now? Now, of course, true, the dollar is devalued. So that doesn't necessarily mean that it has the same purchasing power per se, but it just depends. You're not going to stop this. This is the money of the future. And people still haven't figured it out yet. And don't listen to the dummies in the chat. I have no idea what it is and what. It ain't real. I can't touch it. Yeah, can you touch the app on your phone for your bank? No. Do you see the money when you transfer it on Zelle? Do you touch it? No. So enough of these low tier boomer arguments. Now, back to Attali. How many Atreides nuclear economic warheads do you have? The revolutions. Here's a color revolution I forgot about. He says that we've just seen the success, apparently, of Europe's remarkable Velvet Revolution. So this was the CIA's color revolution in Czechoslovakia, known as the Velvet Revolution. It was one a color revolution I totally forgot. This led to the opening up of the economy there to a market economy. And then he says that future successful color revolutions might occur. Some of them did. Of course, in Ukraine, it was the Orange Revolution. By the way, that doesn't mean we want to go back to some Soviet thing. It just means that, amazingly, Attali cashes this out like it's a dialectical conflict between East and West, Soviet versus Western capitalist. And to those who are of the higher order of this kind of international stuff, they seem to kind of have this spoken/unspoken secret that it doesn't really matter which thing emerged out of the Cold War. Either of these systems will be the placeholder, it will be the phase before we go to the full-on NWO. So if the Soviets had ended up winning in that experiment, then we would have had a Soviet-dominated technocracy. That's why we saw a lot of H.G. Wells, Bertrand Russell, right? Early on, they were saying, hey, the Soviet experiment is running wonderfully. Maybe that's the model of the future technocratic governance, right? That's why Russell says that it's Plato's Republic. Plato's Republic, Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Did you even know the USSR? Socialist Republic? There is an even more ominous and less visible threat on the horizon that has to do with the very warp and woof of the NWO. Its liberal ideology of consumerism and pluralism. The essence of both democracy and the market is choice. But what happens when choice is not given and available to all people? He says that the system might begin to crack when it's realized that there's not actually choice. And he says that really the whole system is grounded on a nihilistic indifference and the cult of immediacy, which I thought was interesting. That's true. I agree. There is a cult of immediacy, which is what technology provides, this convenience. And it's great to have that efficiency and that convenience. However, there's a trade-off, because when you trade off everything for convenience and immediacy, oftentimes we're actually trading off a lot of good things too. So we're trading our privacy nowadays for a lot of convenience and immediacy. We're trading local business for the convenience and immediacy of Jeffrey Bezos and his drone army that's going to bring the packages, right? Rather than driving to the local business to buy these things so that we can save $1 and give the oligarchs of Silicon Valley more and more power and control. And he says, all of this might collapse into a possible nihilistic revolt. Interesting. He doesn't say exactly who would revolt, but I think he thinks maybe the poorer classes. But of course, if they revolt, right, they're not going to revolt against the actual people in control. They're going to revolt against people that they are duped into revolting against, like the local business owner who makes $200,000 a year. As if that's the person who's like, the elite. Okay. No, that's not the elite, dummy. That's who employs and gives jobs to people in the local community. Amazingly, he says the culture of choice must not be allowed to embrace processes that would transform life itself through tinkering with human DNA and destroying the genetic heritage of the human race, the diverse genetic heritage. Well, that's fascinating. So Jacques Attali almost sounds like he's warning against transhumanism and genetic manipulation, and that's quite a change from what he's pushing in 2006. So he's a lot more cautious and, dare we say, almost traditional in ways in this 1991 book versus his 2006 book, which says that transhumanism is the tip of the spear of the NWO. He cites, of all people, well, let me rephrase this. He says that we can never allow the biological limitations or borders to be overrun or destroyed. The great paradox of global consumer democracy is that the rights to pleasure and happiness might be a toxic elixir we are forcing our children to drink. Amazing. Wow, that sounds like us. Because this is the point we make oftentimes to libertarians when we're debating. From whence do you derive these ideas of rights? Perhaps there are rights. But on what grounds and in your system, what's the justification for rights, especially since many of you are low-tier Reddit-level atheists? Where, in any sense at all, do you imagine that there's a right if we are matter in motion? This is fiction. Where do we get rights to choice and pleasure and consumption? Well, these are just assumed. Attali says we're going to have a new definition of the sacred. Well, I agree. Like, it seems like modern society has actually divested itself from the sacred. Attali notices that. But of course, there's no such thing as inventing a new definition of it. You can't invent new definitions. It'd just be made up. So Attali's secular, sort of materialist approach, pragmatic approach to these questions is not going to get us anywhere. I mean, to be honest with you, this first chapter, it sounds like Jordan Peterson. I mean, you got some interesting insights. I wouldn't say it's as right-wing as, quote-unquote right-wing as Jordan Peterson, but it sounds like a chapter that Jordan Peterson could write. And then he says, look, let's go back to history and see if we can do some archaeology of ideas to find some historical forms and structures. Now, this chapter, again, was actually fairly fascinating. It's a great insight into the mind of the global elite about how they view things. And in every global elite text, almost all of them, right, we get the same process, right? We have to do the same thing where we have to go through the history, and really what it ends up being is the global elite storytelling, right? We need the history lesson from them, and then they give us the storytelling, which allows them to then posit that their version of where we're going in the NWO is the only rational one to go into. He says history tells us that man has these sort of stages and there's these sort of phases. And he says that we're going to look at social forms and the myths that cultures utilize to create social cohesion. And he says the first thing that happens is that they invent and make up hierarchy. I would say that's true, right, from a historical perspective. I mean, I don't think all hierarchy is invented, but there is a sense in which hierarchy is natural, is what we're saying, right? And this again sounds kind of like, I think you could say he's probably read Foucault. I mean, he's probably read a lot, Toynbee, Foucault, Outlines of History, H.G. Wells. I'm sure he's read all these people to kind of put together this journey. Probably Comte, right? Auguste Comte has the same idea of like progressing civilizations and ages of man. It's kind of arbitrary, but he says, so basically mankind develops hierarchies in order to have a functioning society. They make up categories in value and distinction. So this kind of sounds almost like Nietzsche, right? They also come up with a anointed king or prince who has the monopoly of violence. So here he sounds like a libertarian. They place this right of justice and violence in this single ruler, and then we get the investiture of violence. Then violence gets managed by also the priest class. So the priest class rises, is very Nietzschean. The priest class also kind of competes with or synthesizes with, synergizes with the prince. He calls this prince, priest and prince here. And we're not talking about Prince like Purple Rain. Purple rain, purple rain. Purple Rain, R-E-I-G-N. Oh, get it? Prince and priest? Get it? Purple Rain. I'll make it rain underneath my rain. Elect me and you'll be rich. I'll make it rain underneath my purple rain. By the way, if you would hit like and share, welcome everybody. Then he says, the priest class was also perceptive in that an orderly society, he seems to say they made it up, needed the idea of sacrifice. We need sacrifice and scapegoats. Scapegoats might be the sinner, the enemy tribes, the whoever. The problem of the society is the scapegoat. He says, really, this is all mythology that the priests repeat to control society. The notion of the sacred, then, is intimately tied into this power structure that brings order to violence to control society. Ever since the first sedentary social forms, perhaps, say, 10,000 years ago, there have been three ways to control man's violence: the religious control, the military control, and the economic control. The first, the religious, mediates man's relationship with nature and the fact of his death. The second, the relationship between the social forms, that is, the military. And the third, the economic, with each of the social forms. These three ways control violence and thus define the order, corresponding to various types of social forms or social structures. These orders, which can in turn be called the orders of sacred, force, and money. Sacred, force, and money. The three key elements here. Multiple forms of order and sacred continue up into the present day as well. However, the modern forms have seen religious power displaced by the political and the economic. So political economy has replaced the religious power. Thus, today we essentially have no sacred. The sacred has no power, but without the sacred, there is no power, and so other entities are actually invested with sacred power. He says if you go back to ancient worldviews, these were all integrated. For example, all of life was divine, part of the divine mythos, a manifestation of the divine. For example, animism. You saw every object has a spirit that indwells it. The eating of flesh and animals, and perhaps even cannibalism, was part of this perpetual cycle of nature. This is a very Foucault, very Nietzsche type analysis. Everything was seen and subsumed under the order of the sacred in a unified holistic worldview. Thus, nothing, whether it's birth, death, art, or life, is not a part of this worldview. Today, we've moved away from that worldview where animism, he's just calling animism any kind of religious worldview that sees everything as in some sense related to or owned by the divine or sacred. Now, the sacred has been replaced with products. I'd say that's true. So now we've moved away from animism to where sacred objects are now consumable products. And he says this is a natural outworking of the rule of money. Once we transition to the money power in modernity, post-capitalism, he's saying, then we no longer see these things as sacred because they're not in any sense related to a transcendent. They only have the human horizontal plane relative value insofar as they're useful to humans. Thus, no transcendent here. Doesn't mean that there can't be. It's just saying that this is the attitude, the modus operandi of the system. That's all he's saying. He says, thus, capitalism gives rise to efficiency, immediacy, and streamlining, or the Burnham type stuff, managerial elite, etc. Taylorism. He says we can look back, in fact, to market forms. Capitalism is the 9th form. I don't know where he came up with. He just sort of came up with these forms. He says there's 9 forms, and we're in the 9th, and he's going to list these in a minute. At the center of each of these forms or phases is a dominant city-state. And these city-states are ruled by elites that define the ideology of the city-state. In fact, religious revolutions are oftentimes a determining factor in the power structure of these elite city-states. Now, notice, this is one of the global elite telling you that the global elite rule from city-states. Is he a conspiracy theorist? No, he's one of the global elite. He's the Kissinger of France, telling you what I say. Each market form uses technology that is more efficient than the predecessors in utilizing energy and organizing communication. A form is stable in so long as it creates enough wealth to maintain the demand for its products. When it begins to falter or is hampered, this market form weakens and gives way to the next. Thus, there's an intimate connection between money, power, and tech. Then he says, the newest form that comes when a new form organizes will be a new center. When technology here and social relations allow for competing businesses on the market to replace non-market services by a new mass product object, the market will then obey and new added value. Mark Carney, $1. I work in cybersecurity. I know Bitcoin is auditable and traceable. Yeah, I'm aware of the public ledger. And he says it is not a good currency. It is a good store of wealth. I understand that, but you can have the something else that's a layer 2, or you can have something else that's a stable coin, or the dollar can continue to exist but be backed by something like Bitcoin. So it doesn't have to be the day-to-day thing itself. It can just be the backing for whatever the day-to-day thing is, a digital dollar or something like that. So I'm aware of that. But also the fact that it's decentralized and that it's a public ledger, it means that it is auditable and traceable in the sense of like bad actors. But also a lot of these entities that would do this, right, they might not be here in 10 or 15 years or 20 years. The 8 forms. I'm sorry, I missed Philip Edenhorn. This is the top 10 global elite streams. Thank you. This one, or you mean that you want a top 10 global elite? MG sends $3 and says, I just want to hear that sweet song. Yeah, exactly. Let's hear it. Ready? Next up is the 8 forms. After the song. From the 13th century to now, 8 successive forms have emerged. Again, I have no idea where he gets. I guess he's just picking the 8 most powerful city-states from 1300. Why he picks 1300, I don't know. Bruges, 1300. Venice, 1450. Antwerp, 1500. Genoa, 1550. Amsterdam, 1650. London, 1750. Boston retarded, 1880. And New York, 1930. So basically saying that we're kind of at the end of the New York Wall Street dollar dominance era. As technology progresses and is invented, production improves and society is able to then cut the cost of goods and services. And whoever is better at that becomes the new center of power of the city-states. Notice that he doesn't say it's nation-states. It's these powerful city centers. New York, London, etc. He says each time there's a new form, it reduces the power of the family in the previous form. Interesting. A world economy always has an urban center of gravity, a city, that is the logistics and heart of this activity. Dominant cities do not dominate forever. They're eventually replaced by another. And what determines that? Apparently it is tech. The essential question must be answered. Well, who decides what region or city becomes the center? A city becomes the center when its constellation of industrial and political elites organize themselves around a cultural project and harness the resources to develop new technologies for faster and better means. This is going to be a key element, I believe, in determining who will have power in the future. The new petrodollar is a CBDC. None of that's going to work. I mean, a CBDC that they put out is just going to be it's going to be an electronic fiat. How is that going to be any better? An electronic fiat will probably be worse than a physical fiat. This is not fiat. It's the opposite of that. Now, listen to this. What is the form that rules where we are now? Well, where we are now in this New York, post-New York 1930s era, get this. Material abundance and geographical advantage rarely amount to what makes for the key city center. So what is it then that allows for certain cities to arise? It's not the answer I expected. You might think, well, physical location or material abundance. And he's saying, no, it's not actually that. This is his thesis. What allows a certain region or city to arise to become one of these key centers is rather that it avoids becoming entangled in wars. Foreign entanglements bleed the rivals and allows the city that doesn't get involved to become the center. Isn't it interesting that what allowed America to become what it was, the world power? Non-interventionism, not becoming entangled in all these wars, which drains and destroys the country to prop up this ridiculous form of imperialism is the only way to put it. And by the way, it is that. Brzezinski calls it the American Empire. That, by the way, was all designed by the CFR. The CFRs who decided to turn America away from a protectionist, non-interventionist power into a global police, international interventionist power. The CFR achieved that in the 1920s. That transition, that was their key function under Rockefeller and other oligarchs, and that's why we're in this situation that we're in. The Second World War was the midwife of the New York dominant Wall Street market form. The desire of families and homemaking, of families for homemaking durables was met by this Keynesian New Deal social spending policy of the post-war period. And what is Keynesianism? Fabian socialist economics. Milton Keynes was a Fabian. All of the institutions post-World War II that were set up, you might think, were they communist? Were they capitalist? No, dummies. They're both. It's called Fabian socialism, which is the merger of monopoly capital and communism, known as reformed Marxism or Fabian socialism. And literally all of the post-World War II institutions that exist now today, the IMF, the World Bank, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, they are Keynesian institutions. That's the world that we live under. In fact, there's a whole list of these institutions in the book. And that's because all of these British elites that set this up were all part of this same structure. The Royal Institute for International Affairs was created under the leadership of Lionel Curtis and was structured by Fabians like R.H. Tawney, John Maynard Keynes, Philip Noel Barker, as well as Fabian collaborators and synthesizers like the London School of Economics professor Arnold Toynbee, who became the director of Chatham House. Thus, all of these institutions that were set up, League of Nations, United Nations, RIIA, CFR, Socialist League, World Bank, International Monetary Fund, Aspen Institute, World Council of Churches, NATO, Bilderberg, they're literally all set up by Fabian socialists. It's not even that hard to figure this out. It's not even like controversial. And that book is way better and more modern and updated. This is just the older version of this history. And people are all confused about this because they think that it's like classical Marxism. It's not classical Marxism, okay? It's not anti-capital. It's Marxism that's pro-capital and allied with it. And Attali admits that, yes, that is the structure of the existing order. Now he says that the competition, and I guess that's why he has this weird woodcut. I mean, it looks like a Dyer. I don't know what it is. But this is like two guys competing, so I guess this is about competition. Now, this next chapter is where he gets things wrong. There's a couple insights in the chapter, though, because he says, for example, the very beginning, that our system is based on pluralism. That is the system of liberal markets, democratic, open liberal markets. It requires pluralism. He says we could describe this as a pyramid with two pillars. I kid you not. This is his Masonic terminology. He says the world structure is like a pyramid with two pillars. Oh, I'm sorry, Jacques Attali. Are you an idiot conspiracy theorist? Because anyone else were to say this, they would be immediately deemed as an idiot conspiracy theorist. Yet when you say it, using your obvious Masonic imagery, and by the way, Grand Orient Freemasonry has always been very powerful in France, and most of its leaders and presidents are members of the Grand Orient Lodge, etc. He says the world order in the Cold War can be described as a pyramid with two pillars. The pyramid is the shape that is taken by the eighth market form, which is the dollar. It is the petrodollar, the universal international currency that presently rules. And the two pillars are the maintenance of the dialectics of global order of the U.S. and the USSR. However, this one pillar of the USSR has just collapsed. This will now give America the opportunity to become the center again. Then he says there's two competitors to America that might displace America as the center. He says those competitors, and this is where he's wrong. These competitors for the next few decades will be Japan and the EU. Okay, well that didn't happen. In fact, 4 years after this book, Japan's economy collapsed into what's called the lost decades. Over the period of 1995 to 2023, Japan's GDP fell from 5 trillion to 4 trillion. Real wages fell 11%. The lost decade. So perhaps Americanists understood the threat of Japan. And I remember in the 90s, there were these books that were coming out. There were books coming out about the rise of Japan, the threat of Japanese, economy to the West and whatever. But whatever happened, however this occurred, I don't know all the details of this. Enough happened such that Japan was definitely emasculated and cucked into being essentially unable to have population below replacement population levels. And I guess essentially the toxic culture that was exported was enough to do this. I don't know exactly. I don't know enough about Japanese geopolitics to say. But he says that the other competitor would be the EU. That didn't work. The EU has not become a competitor to America. So exactly where that's going to go, I don't know. However, he says that the dream of the EU in 1991 would perhaps be that it could step forward to become a competitor. Unfortunately, it turns out, as even Attali says, just like Japan, Europe's replacement population levels are not enough to even give it that status anymore. And he's writing prior to all of the non-Europeans suddenly entering Europe in the past 20 years. So Attali got all of that very wrong. However, he was perceptive enough to realize that population displacement is more than sufficient to erode the nation state, combined with the power of the nomadic device, which severs from one's heritage, family, tradition, etc. So that's the first half of the very insightful geopolitical text from Jacques Attali, the book Millennium. It's a very quick read. It's only 100 pages. And so in the next couple days, I will have the part 2 up. I want a reminder to you guys that I did get part 2 of the Sexpionage history book up. That book is complete. You can watch the part 2 over here on Rockfin, or you can subscribe at Jay's Analysis to get access to the archives of the last 10 years of deep geopolitical analysis, theology, book reports, book reviews, analyses, etc., debates, lectures, the rest of the Global Elite book series. You can get all that in the archives at Jay's Analysis for $4.95 a month, $60 a year. You subscribe in the show description at the links, or you can subscribe to the same material over here on Rockfin. Rockfin is